Hello historians and welcome back. Today we will be looking at the reign of Queen Mary I. Mary had her title of princess stripped from her in 1533 upon the birth of her half-sister, the Princess Elizabeth, and Mary was made illegitimate. Mary's brother Edward VI died in 1553 and Mary had to fight for her throne as her cousin Jane Grey was named heir instead of her. After winning over the public support, Jane happily gave Mary the throne after only 13 days on the throne. Mary's coronation was on the 1st of October 1553 at Westminster Abbey. Mary's former stepmother and friend, Anne of Cleves, took place of honour along with her sister Elizabeth at the lavish coronation. The two ladies shared an open chariot and they were given new dresses made from a rich silver material. They walked directly behind the new queen in the procession to Westminster Abbey. At her ceremony, Mary was given 2 sceptres and crowned both king and queen, as England had never coronated a queen before. Not like this anyway. So those running the ceremony didn't really have any idea on what they were doing, as a queen was and kinda still is of a lower rank to a king. This is why Queens Anne, Victoria and Elizabeth II never made their husbands king consort, as they would have technically outranked them. Mary stated that her coronation ring was a wedding ring to her country and that she loves her country like her mother loved her children. Mary was very good at PR. That is until she marries Philip. As a staunch Catholic, Mary was horrified at her father's and brother's Reformation policies. And now that she was queen, she had the power to reverse all of Edward's Protestant policies and made the Pope the head of England's state, not the monarch.
Not a great plan.
This upset and confused a lot of people, as nobody knew where they stood. As her Catholic reversal continued, Mary went from merely reversing policies to persecuting Protestants. Lady Jane Grey, who was currently in the Tower of London, and who had many people calling for her death, was horrified by what Mary had done, as Jane was a Protestant and wrote a letter to the Queen slandering her and her religion. What she wrote couldn't have been nice, because, according to Jane,
Catholic souls were the sinking kennels of Satan.
Right.
Thankfully, Mary ignored her remarks. I would not suggest insulting the woman who could literally sign your death warrant, especially when Jane and Guildford would be tried and convicted of high treason the next month on the 14th of November 1553. Jane pleaded guilty, but Mary still wasn't convinced of Jane's guilt. After all, she was just a pawn of the manipulative men around her. Mary's conscience would not allow her to put a teenage cousin to death and suspended her death sentence. As I said earlier, Mary was good at PR. By sparing Jane, Mary is able to spin this whole narrative of the evil Northumberland manipulating her brother Edward into writing Mary out of the succession. It was Northumberland's wishes, not Edward's. Edward would never have written her out of the succession if he was in his right mind, because it was pretty obvious that Mary was his true heir. Jane even said after the trial that she, meaning Mary in this instance, is a merciful queen. In early 1554, word got out that Mary was planning on marrying, which is great because England needs an heir, but not so great because it's Mary's cousin Philip, who is also a Catholic, and the match was very unpopular with the public and the Privy Council. It is Mary's marriage that destroys her popularity with her subjects. A series of uprisings would ensue during January and February, which would be known as the Wyatt Rebellion, after its leader, Thomas Wyatt. There is a common misconception that this rebellion was in order to put Jane back on the throne instead of Mary, but this actually wasn't the case. Jane's father was involved in the rebellion, and thus that is how she's implicated, but the rebels actually intended to depose Mary in favour of her sister Elizabeth, who was a Protestant. Thomas Wyatt, the leader, travelled from Kent to London, and when he reached London, his feeble rebellion was defeated and he was captured. Wyatt, Henry Grey, Lady Jane and her husband Guildford were all executed as a result. The rebellion proved that the threat of Jane was real and that she was too dangerous to be kept alive, which led to Mary signing her death warrant. The rebellion made Mary view Jane as a figurehead for future Protestant revolts, despite them wanting Elizabeth as queen and not Jane, and yet somehow it would be Jane that would be executed. Rather cruelly, Mary deliberately had Henry Grey's execution after Jane's so he could watch what he had done to his daughter. Elizabeth, however, got off lightly. She was imprisoned in the Tower of London, despite protesting her innocence in the Wyatt revolt, and 2 months later she was downgraded to house arrest. Mary gave the Dudleys one last chance to spare their lives. If they converted to Catholicism, she would spare them. However, both Jane and Guildford refused, and so Mary signed Jane and Guildford's death warrant on the 7th of February 1554, and they were executed on the 12th of February. Jane took her prayer book with her to the scaffold and handed it over just before she knelt for her beheading. Jane had written some messages in her prayer book. One of them is a heartfelt message to her father. She writes, "The Lord comforts your grace, and that the word wherein all creatures can only be comforted. And thou it hath pleased God to take away 2 of your children. Yet think not that you have lost them, but trust that we, by leaving this mortal life, have won an immortal life. Your Grace's humble daughter, Jane Dudley." Jane signing her message as Jane Dudley instead of Jane the Queen adds more innocence. She wasn't trying to be a martyr. It just proves that she didn't lust for the throne. Instead, she was just a young girl who was newly married and had her life cut short. Her father would follow on the 23rd, and Wyatt would be executed on the 11th of April. Mary was more like her father than she thought. Paranoid, she invited Jane's younger sisters, Catherine and Mary Grey, to court as maids of honours, so she could keep a close eye on them.
I'm watching you, Wazowski. Always watching.
Despite the opposition, Mary and Philip's marriage went ahead on the 25th of July 1554, and they were married at Winchester Cathedral. Mary knew her marriage wasn't popular, but she saw it as her duty to provide a Catholic heir. Philip was a son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was hoping to add England to his empire through Philip. However, Parliament did not want that to happen. Parliament agreed to the marriage after Charles V consented to leave Mary in full control of England and to keep the throne in English hands if the marriage is childless, which he did agree to. Mary's grandparents, Isabella and Ferdinand, had retained sovereignty of their respective realms during their marriage, but so far in England there was no precedence to follow, and the common law at the time stated that all lands and titles that belonged to a woman would belong to the man upon marriage, which was why Parliament insisted on the prenup before the marriage went ahead. The document for the marriage agreement stated that Philip would have the title of King of England, and documents would have both of their names on, and they would have joint authority, but only while Mary lived. England would not be obliged to support Charles in any war, and Philip could not act in foreign affairs without the consent of Mary. Philip was not happy, so, to make him happy, Charles abdicated from the throne of Naples so Philip could be King of Naples in his own right, and ultimately made him worthy of marrying a queen regnant. Philip also inherited the kingdom of Jerusalem, and thus Mary became Queen of Naples and Jerusalem upon her marriage to Philip. Philip and Mary communicated in a mixture of Spanish, French and Latin, as Philip couldn't speak English, and at their wedding, Mary was sat on the right in the king's seat, and Philip was sat on the left in the consort's seat. Mary loved her husband, but he didn't love her, and by August he was campaigning in Flanders and rarely came to England. Mary pined for him, but Philip was put off by her bad breath, although she did have a condition, so it wasn't technically her fault. Additionally, she also tried to tempt him back home by sending him his favourite meat pies. He ate the pies, but he didn't come back.
It's funny because it's true.
In the September, Mary thought that she might be pregnant. She stopped menstruating, gained weight, and felt nauseated in the mornings. Without the invention of a pregnancy test and her showing signs, there was no reason to doubt her beliefs. Parliament passed an act that made Philip regent in the event of Mary's death in childbirth. Pregnancy in the Tudor era was very much seen as the woman's thing, so she withdrew from public life and her doctors had to diagnose her from afar, based on what Mary could tell them about her quote-unquote pregnancy. 7 months later, in April 1555, Mary was preparing for her birth. Philip returned to England and persuaded Mary to release her sister Elizabeth from house arrest, which she did, and then she called her to court to witness the birth of her replacement as heir. You could ask the question, if Mary was so desperate to provide an heir that wasn't Elizabeth, why didn't she name Mary Queen of Scots as her heir? I mean, it's a good point, as both Marys were Catholic, unlike Elizabeth. But remember, Queen Mary Tudor was half Spanish through her mother, Catherine. Queen Mary of Scots had an alliance with France, Spain's enemy. It was better to have Elizabeth on the throne, who might convert to Catholicism, than a French sympathiser. Philip, who was also Spanish, had concerns about Mary Queen of Scots being second in line to the throne, so he suggested that Elizabeth should marry his cousin, and he was probably Mary's cousin as well, Emmanuel Philibert, Duke of Savoy, to secure a Catholic succession. Philip was convinced that Elizabeth was submissive, and that she could be converted and would do whatever she was told, if he found the right husband to manipulate her. But Gloriana refused. Mary continued to show signs of pregnancy, including the bump, until the July, when her stomach started to recede. Some historians believe that Mary had a phantom pregnancy because she was so desperate to conceive, while others believe she was most likely had a tumour or a cyst, as she clearly displayed an inflated stomach. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Mary had pre-signed documents weeks before she was due, announcing her baby boy. I mean, it is only a 50% chance it will be a boy. We're fortunate with hindsight to know what happens next, but for Mary, I could imagine her desperation, her anxiety, and humiliation as the realisation sunk in that she wasn't actually pregnant. Because as we know, no baby came. By August, everyone had given up on Mary's pregnancy. Philip left England to command his armies back in Flanders, and Mary saw this false pregnancy as God's punishment for having tolerated heretics. With Philip gone, Mary was miserable, and now she was convinced that God was angry with her, and so starts the reign of Bloody Mary. She believed that the only way she could make right with God is to burn as many heretics as she could find.
Boy, that escalated quickly.
One such heretic was John Hooper, the Bishop of Gloucester. He had tied a bag of gunpowder around his neck in hopes of a quick end, but it failed to ignite, and he suffered in the flames for 45 minutes. About 800 Protestants fled England during Mary's reign to Germany and Geneva, and as the burnings increased, Mary's popularity declined. Elizabeth had been with her sister throughout the false pregnancy ordeal. Mary agreed that Elizabeth could return to Hatfield with the staff of her choice, which she did, but Elizabeth stayed at court with her sister until the 18th of October. History likes pitting these two as rivals, but I think this is an example of compassion and sisterly love, and also Elizabeth being tactful to return to favour. Mary had her father's longtime advisor, Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer, burnt at the stake. Cranmer was a Protestant and refused to convert to Catholicism, so he was burnt at the stake on the 21st of March 1556. Mary was now in need of a new archbishop, so she chose Reginald Pole, the estranged son of her former governess, Lady Margaret Pole, who took up the role pretty much straight after Cranmer's execution.
That was fast.
Philip returned to England from March to July in 1557 for more pies. No, not really. He actually needed English support in the war that Spain was fighting against France, but he had been banned from getting involved in foreign affairs, so he had to get Mary's consent. Mary was so desperate for Philip to stay that she agreed, hoping he would be happy. Despite her counsellor's warning of ruining their trade relations with France, England had suffered financially under both of the reigns of Edward VI and King Henry VIII, and quite frankly, we just lacked the supplies and money. By January of 1558, we had lost the war with France, and Mary's biggest legacy after the nickname was that she lost Calais, the last English stronghold in France.
You blew it!
Losing Calais had made her very unpopular, especially with the English nobles who lived or had property in Calais. Calais had been in English hands since the conquest of King Edward III, a source of great sadness to the Queen. She was reported to have said at the time, "When I am dead and chested, you will find Calais written on my heart." After Philip's visit in 1557, Mary again thought that she was pregnant with a baby, due in March 1558. She decreed in her will that her husband would be the regent during the minority of their child, but yet again, no child would be born, and Mary's health was failing her, potentially from ovarian cancer or cysts. On the 6th of November 1558, Mary, realising that her time was near, reluctantly recognised Elizabeth as her successor. Mary would die on the 17th of November 1558 at the age of 42. She died at St. James's Palace. She died childless, sick, and deserted by Philip. The day before she died, England and France were at war, and the peace treaty had been brought to the chamber for her to sign, but she was too ill. When she died the next day, her minister went to her bedroom to try and find the document, but Mary's chief lady-in-waiting used the treaty to wrap Mary's corpse.
What?
When Mary died, she left Elizabeth a will, asking Elizabeth to become a Catholic, for the Spanish jewels to be returned to Philip, and for Mary to be buried next to her mother, Catherine of Aragon. All of which Elizabeth didn't do.
The cheek, the nerve, the gall, the audacity, and the gumption.
To give Elizabeth her credit, she did, however, give Mary a Catholic send-off that was regal and fit for the first coronated Queen of England, as she didn't want to encourage disrespect for royalty. After all, it was now her turn. Mary was buried at Westminster Abbey on the 14th of December 1558, and Elizabeth didn't attend the funeral. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. If you would like to watch another video, may I suggest my videos on Mary's early life, where I cover when she was princess and the Lady Mary. What about my video on Mary's parents, King Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon? Or how about her predecessors on the throne, Lady Jane Grey, or her half-brother King Edward VI? Next time, we will be exploring Queen Elizabeth I's life as the Princess Elizabeth. But until then, have a wonderful day.